It's an honor to chair the first panel this morning. I want to extend my gratitude to the organizers for inviting me. And I will say a few things about myself and then introduce our panel. Unfortunately, Sharon Ven's flight was canceled last night out of Edmonton because of mechanical problems, and she couldn't be rebooked. So she's not going to be joining us this morning. But we have an incredible panel to help us work through these questions about the 10 principles to decolonization. That's a question mark. UN DRIP, the TRC, and Canada's new relationship. So the panel description is inviting us to think about the 10 principles as the only really concrete expression of Canada's plan to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. So it's inviting us to really look at the 10 principles with a greater scrutiny than perhaps they've received, than perhaps the attention that they've received. So the question posed to the panelists is, in what ways do they reveal this new government is committed to a new relationship, if at all? So I'll be your chair this morning. My name's Shiri Pasternak. I'm a very newcomer to Canada. I'm the first generation in my family here. My first language is Hebrew. I'm an assistant professor of criminology at Ryerson University and the research director of the Centre for Indigenous Governance. And our panel today includes two people who I've worked with really closely, Janice Makokis and Russ Diabo. Most recently hashing out these questions about the 10 principles and related liberal matters on the national steering committees of Defenders of the Land and Idle No More. It's a great honor to be in public hashing out the same conversations we have on endless conference calls late into the night as we're dozing off in our respective time zones. So I'll start my introductions to my left with Janice Makokis, who's a proud, beautiful, and brilliant Nihia Ikwa, Cree woman from Treaty 6 territory from the Saddle Lake Cree Nation in what is now called Alberta. She holds a joint position between the Yellowhead Tribal Council and the University of Alberta, where she is an Indigenous Relations / policy advisor / Native Studies professor who works on developing Indigenous programming and curriculum and working close with communities to figure out the implications of policy, legislation, and laws that are coming down. She's really one of the sharpest minds, I think, on the country, in the country working on these issues, and certainly is an authority in the prairies on figuring out the implications for treaty people of all of these changes in the policy landscape. And to her left is Russ Diabo, member of the Ganawage Mohawks and a policy advisor for decades now. He's worked really closely with the Algonquins, both directly with the Algonquins of Barrier Lake and for the Algonquin Nation Secretariat. He's also done work in the South Central Interior of British Columbia with Secwepemc bands and the Interior Alliance, mostly with bands who are on unceded Aboriginal title territory, and really one of, again, the sharpest public commentators on issues of policy, legislation, and law in the country. I know a lot of us pay close attention to Russell Diabo's Twitter feed whenever big announcements are coming down, because we know he's going to have a minute-by-minute, blow-by-blow analysis and breakdown of what's happening and what it means. To his left is Piers Kreps, who's an undergraduate student here at McMaster University. He's an Inuk student, and he has participated in one of the only UN models that actually models not the nation-state system, but the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues to try to work out and model new forms of international governance related to Indigenous peoples. Piers hopes to bridge his studies to further mobilize Inuit at the federal and international level and further connect with his family in Tuktoyaktuk. So please join me in welcoming this incredible panel to start our day today.
I just want to thank the people of this territory for allowing me to be here to speak with you. Ironically or not, the person that picked me up from the airport last night is from Six Nations. And I asked him, whose people's territory am I on? Who do I need to acknowledge? And he said, well, that's kind of, it could be controversial, but I think the safest way to answer that is to acknowledge that you're on the Mississaugas of the New Credit and the Haudenosaunee territory. You'll be okay. And I said, okay, because I don't want to go into Haudenosaunee territory doing something that, or saying something that I shouldn't be saying. So, kitatamska tinawao kakio nitutamtik wagu magantik wapamasquasis nitsigasun nihioasquel nia onexkabonik otinia. So in my language, I'm Cree, Plains Cree from Treaty 6. I just thanked you all for welcoming me here and for inviting me to be on these lands to speak with you today. It's truly an honor and a privilege to be sitting on the panel that I am today. And when we were coordinating how the speaking was going to unfold, who was going to be speaking first, I was voluntold by Sharon and Russ that I had to go first. And when you're on a phone call with them, because they have years of experience, you kind of just say, okay, then I will do that. So I'm going to get into this presentation, and I titled it Continued Genocide or Reconciliation, because as somebody who is trained in law and examines these documents like a fine-tooth comb, what you hear from the media and what you read in documents are very two separate things. And I think that the government does a really good sell job of promoting an agenda of reconciliation that really needs to be questioned and examined. And I'm glad that McMaster is hosting this conference, because I think that you're leading the way in gathering the right people to be in this room to have these difficult conversations. So I'm going to get into this. I'm going to take you through a few things here. My position and analysis of this framework comes from a treaty position. And as somebody who is a descendant of treaty, and I know that there are a lot of different interpretations of what that means, and the government does a really good job of promoting their interpretation of treaty, which is that we ceded, released, surrendered, and gave up our title and jurisdiction to the land and resources. But that is further from the truth. When I listen to the elders and people that have been involved in this fight for a very long time, that is not the perspective that our people bring to this discussion. And I want to further position this dialogue in getting you to think about genocide instead of reconciliation, because I think what we're seeing is a pattern of ongoing genocide. And I'm going to take you through the international convention that establishes and lays that out. And then I'm going to get into some of the TRC calls to action, and specifically what is taking place in Alberta, in our region, because that's where I come from. And I can pretty much guarantee you that in every other region across the country, there are various interesting things happening with respect to the rollout of what is taking place in the reconciliation framework from both the federal government and in the provinces. So in listening to me take you through this, I want you to think about whose version of reconciliation this is and who benefits from this reconciliation project. Because in my view, I'm one of those lingering cynicists that Hayden talked about, where I'm looking at this from a very critical lens, because I'm in places and spaces and sitting in meetings with ministers and government officials where they are saying one thing, and documents and other things are happening on the side that are completely opposite to what you hear in the media. So that's why I want to ask people to really examine and think critically about these things. And I want to bring us back to the 1969-70 era, because I come from a family of treaty fighters, treaty protectors, real sovereigntists who believed in our, oh, sorry, I'm changing it on here, but you're not seeing it. So these are the questions that I'm posing to you. And then I'll start here. I come from a family of treaty fighters, treaty protectors, and sovereigntists who believed in the strength of our ways of being, knowing, and our inherent laws that stem from the land and the connection that we have to the Creator. And I think it was Rick Montour who opened this morning, and Vanessa spoke about how we have very sophisticated laws, governance structures. And I can tell you in the work that I do and working with elders in the communities, that is so true, because none of our governance or legal structures are written down per se. There is some stuff written about it, but in learning about this, the sophistication of it is beyond what Canada proposes that it thinks to know about us. And so I'm taking us back here to the 1969 era, because I think what's happening now is a reproduction of what happened back then. And for those of us that are involved in advocacy work and really do Indigenous mobilization and resurgence work, there's a pattern here that's happening. And every 5 to 10 years, there's like this eruption of conflict that exists. And so in 1969, my grandmother, who is standing to the right of the late Dr. Harold Cardinal, who was leading the Indian Association of Alberta at the time, they were resisting the church's move to try and take over or give the school and the lands that belonged to the school to the local town. And my kukum, my grandmother at the time, was working in Indian affairs, and she caught wind of information where the minister at the time, Kretsch, was making certain moves to try and collaborate with the town and the churches to sell that land to the town for like $5. And they were like, no, we're not going to let you do that, because we believe that we can teach our children and deliver education for our people better than the churches or the government of Canada. And so they staged a sit-in for 21 days until their demands were met. And I would suggest that what we're dealing with now is an extension of the sophistication of what the government did back then. I was driving here this morning with Russ, and I said, this is worse than it was back then, isn't it? And he said, yeah. And this is worse than what the Harper government proposed through its omnibus bills. And so I want to position that to bring us back to the fact that this is not something that just, this is an ongoing colonial project we're dealing with here. So this is people in my territory that were protesting what was happening. And the school is at the bottom, where you can see it's an old residential school. And the irony of this is that they were trying to take the Indian out of the child back then, and now they've transformed the school into a tribal college or tribal university now, which is attempting to put the identity of Nihio, Dene people back into our students, because that's a place of resistance, rebuilding, reinvigorating our Indigenous ways, knowledge systems, and laws and legal orders. And as part of the work that I do as an advisor for the Tribal Council, we also have a tribal college there as well. And I know that in this area, there's a few Indigenous run, owned institutions. And I'm bringing this to your attention because in my presentation later, you'll see some of the policy documents and implications of what's rolling out. That is, what they're attempting to do is just completely do away with tribal institutions entirely. And so I bring you to the UN Convention on Genocide, which was established in 1948 by the General Assembly. And what establishes crimes of genocide are these 5 things: killing members of a group, causing serious bodily harm, inflictions, imposing measures intended to prevent births, and forcible transferring of children. Canada signed on to this convention in 1949 and formally ratified that in 1952. But there's some interesting things going on here. And I'm bringing this to your attention because what happened when the TRC announced, it released its findings, there was something interesting that happened there, and that was they called it cultural genocide. And there's a reason why they called it cultural genocide and not genocide, because in international law, you cannot be held culpable or liable for cultural genocide. You can't, like a state that signs on to a UN convention is not found to be culpable for crimes of genocide if you call it cultural genocide. So there's 2 elements to establish this, and I'm not gonna go into detail here, but basically there's a mental element, like a mens rea in criminal law, physical element, actus rea in criminal law. And you have to go through establishing that these things exist. And interestingly, I was looking through, when I was doing my research here, I was going back and trying to look at what the news media was saying about the TRC and cultural genocide at the time. And this was one of the articles that came out. And you notice in the title of this article, Canada was ready to abandon the 1948 Accord if the UN didn't remove cultural genocide ban, records reveal. So that was very intentional on behalf of the state of Canada to have cultural genocide removed from the Genocide Convention. So you can see the relationship in how it rolled out the TRC and identifying that it was cultural genocide, because you could say that, but the actual charge with crimes of genocide wouldn't be able to be established because of that. And one of my friends who wrote her master's in law thesis on this, who lays out very sophisticated legal arguments, her name is Tamara Starblanket, and she has this book coming out, Suffer the Little Children, in the next month. And I strongly recommend people to read this because you will see for yourself what Canada did to absolve itself from genocide under international law. And I took some of her quotes, her arguments out of this book, We Were Here First, Indigenous Peoples as Subjects of International Law, where she says, genocide denial, which I link to reconciliation, conceals the dark colonial laws as policies of the past and present. The destructive and genocidal nature of the civilization process or the forcing of a particular cultural pattern by a dominating colonial state over another national identity has been concealed by the removal of cultural genocide from the crime of genocide in international law. She is the first person, to my knowledge, that has really delved into these legal arguments. And in speaking with her, she told me stories of how difficult it was for her to get this past her committee because, well, for obvious reasons, right? So it took her 7 years to complete her master's in law thesis. But if you ever have the opportunity or take a read of her work, invite her to come speak because she really disrupts the narrative of what the state is putting out right now. And another person that I've had the privilege of working with, which lays the foundation of where these patterns of domination and dehumanization come from, is Stephen Newcomb. And he gets into this whole argument going back to the papal bulls, the doctrine of discovery. And if you were to look at some of the early case law that establishes Aboriginal law in Canada that those of us who go to law school learn about, they come from this doctrine of discovery that he talks about. So now I'm going to get into the TRC stuff. I'm not going to go into detail here, but the TRC came out of the Residential School Settlements Agreement. And I worked in the number 2 part, the independent assessment process, processing claims for survivors for 1 year. And it was probably the most difficult year working in that because it was like I was taken back to those moments of abuse and trauma that every one of those people shared with me when they came to meet me. And a lot of times, I was the first person that they ever disclosed those kinds of situations to. So when I look at the TRC, I come from that perspective as well. And I'm really critical of that because, you know, the government and everybody that's talking about reconciliation, it's like, okay, this happened and let's just get on with it. Let's just forget all of this tragic history that happened to our people. Yeah, we killed you. You know, bad things happen in the residential school, but let's just move on with this reconciliation stuff. So the TRC was released in June of 2015. Its principles were to address truth, healing, and reconciliation. And I highlight in red reconciliation because I believe that we've like jumped forward decades to the reconciliation part, and we haven't even gone to the truth part of what's really going on in this country. And that's a huge contribution to the ongoing misinformation, indoctrination that continues to take place here. So I'm approaching understanding reconciliation by looking at the legal, not the legal definition, but what we see come through in Section 35. And this comes out of Vanderpeet where, and this is a really important phrase here, the Aboriginal rights recognized and affirmed by Section 35 must be directed towards the reconciliation of pre-existence of Aboriginal societies with the sovereignty of the Crown. This is what we are dealing with here when we're talking about policy rollout and what is happening across this country and in the regions and the provinces. Canada is attempting to reconcile its assumed sovereignty with the pre-existence of our Indigenous peoples and nations that were the original peoples that lived here and have title, have our own laws and legal structures. This is what is going on here. And I know Russ is going to get into more detail with this, but I wanted to bring that forward because I don't think people are really understanding what's happening here. And the other part of this is that Canada, and I took this headline from Frank Iacobucci, who is a Supreme Court justice. And he says, and I think this really summarizes what's happening, the path to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples starts with consent. And he's talking about FPIC here. The government needs our consent to move on any type of industry projects, extractive resources, that sort of thing. But the other flip side of this is Canada needs our consent to give up our title, our rights, and what in my region, the domestication of our treaties, because we believe that when we made treaty with the Crown, they were international in scope and international in nature. So why the heck would we say to Canada, okay, we'll accept your Section 35 framework and have it come under the state of Canada when we are nations of peoples that existed before Canada even came into existence? Like, that is the most ridiculous thing ever. But part of this, and how they do this, is they do the good sell job. And I didn't get into analyzing all of these different calls to action, but I started to look at some of them and how they violate the treaty agreement that we made with the Crown. And there's a lot of funny things happening in here. And I'm going to focus on the education for reconciliation component, because I see this happening in the work that I do. Because one of the portfolios that I have as an advisor is education, child welfare, and to look at that. So where is the government getting the idea that we are incapable of developing our own institutions and building that part up? Well, look at the phrases in these calls to action. We call upon the federal, provincial, territorial, and Aboriginal governments, and so forth. Collaboration with survivors, Aboriginal peoples. But what is happening here is they are cherry picking and choosing what they want to address. And that is not what I think we believe to be reconciliation, because there's a lack of truth telling here. There's absolutely no discussion about land and how we're going to deal with the land question, and thinking about who is developing and delivering the reconciliation agendas. So I'm going to get into how they're applying this call number 62, which talks about age-appropriate curriculum to address residential schools and treaties. And for those of you that haven't read Arthur Manuel's book, I strongly suggest you read this. Every person in this country needs to read this book. And I tried to think about how the government, in collaboration with various entities and agencies, do this, how they roll out their propaganda. And I remember one time, I don't know where it was, I think we were in Norway. I was with Russ and Art and a bunch of other people. And again, I was voluntold to be the chair of the North American region at this meeting. And Arthur started to talk about this SWAT team. And I'm like, what do you mean the SWAT team? Do they, like, really? SWAT team? And he's like, yeah, they have a SWAT team, Janice. I'm like, no way. He's like, yeah, they do. So they have this SWAT team with an INAC called the Special Words and Tactics, and their whole mandate is to sell this to the Canadian public so that we take it in and we believe that they have our best interests at heart. But for those of us that look at documents, analyze things critically, it's like, yeah, they're really good at this. They're good at selling this reconciliation agenda. So quickly, what is happening in Alberta with this call to action number 62 is the province took it upon themselves to partner with the Alberta Teachers Association to develop curriculum on treaties for our region. So I'm going to take you through this. This is how this pattern of domination and dehumanization gets perpetuated. So in this document, in this curriculum, it says treaties are constitutionally binding agreements between sovereign nations that set out the conditions for a peaceful alliance and the extinguishment of title from First Nations from the Crown's perspective. So again, we're seeing like another generation of students being raised with the idea that we gave up title to our lands, we gave up complete jurisdiction to who we are, and that it's Canada that has full control and jurisdiction over our lands and territories. And in this one, Treaty Number 7, it says extinguish Indigenous title to the land so the Crown could then exert claim. And so this is what is happening in Alberta. And in the university area, INAC did some funny things in the past 2 years where it had a policy for Indigenous post-secondary institutions that was exclusive to tribal colleges. And what it did was it opened that envelope of funding to now include mainstream institutions. So in Alberta, what I found out was that there was $2.4 million allotted to the region in that funding envelope, but $1 million of that funding was given to a mainstream institution. And so 1.4 million then has to be divvied up to there's 6 Indigenous institutions in Alberta. And if the Indigenous institutions are the ones that are delivering land-based education, language revitalization, knowledge development, mobilization, you can see what is happening here. They're trying to take away the Indigenous institutions and just have mainstream universities deliver some of this programming. And it's hard for me to say that because I work in both places. I work for the University of Alberta, and I also work for a tribal council that is part of an Indigenous college. And so I just want to end on that note because Russ is going to cover what the federal government agenda is rolling out. Thank you.
Sego, Gwegwe. I want to acknowledge the Haudenosaunee and Mississauga territories too, and thank the organizers for inviting me to this conference. I agree with Janice. I think this is an important conference to start critically looking at what this federal government is doing. There needs to be more forums like this to have these discussions because there isn't enough critical analysis, certainly by our chiefs or their organizations to do that. So I want to start off by saying, first of all, if anybody calls me a cynic, I say, no, I'm experienced because I've been around for a while. And one of the things I wanted to talk about was in terms of full disclosure here, I was a Liberal insider at one point. I was one of the founding people that created the Aboriginal Peoples Commission of the Liberal Party of Canada at a Liberal convention in 1990 in Calgary, Alberta, when Jean Kretsch was elected as leader. And of course, in university, I'd studied about Jean Kretsch and the white paper, so I had mixed feelings about that because I don't think Paul Martin would have been any better, but he was the leading candidate. But I want to talk about this Liberal experience a bit because, it gave me insight into how the Liberal Party operates. As Vice President of Policy from 1990 to 94 of the Liberal Party's Aboriginal Commission, 2 weeks after that convention happened, I think Meech Lake died because Elijah Harper ran out the clock, much like the provinces and the Prime Minister ran out the clock on us in the constitutional talks in the 80s. The Meech Lake Accord died, and then what's called the Oka crisis happened in July, a few weeks later. And the Quebec chiefs were in an emergency meeting in Ganawage. The roads had been blocked. The only way in and out was by boat, going from this dock in Lachine across the St. Lawrence River to the docks in the marina in Ganawage. And I was, I think her name was Audrey McLaughlin. She was the NDP leader. She was there talking to the chiefs and that. And I said, well, why the hell isn't Kretsch in there? He's the leader of the opposition now. So we found him we had people that knew he was at his cottage and had his number, and we got him to come out from his cottage to come to the meeting. And they sent me across in a boat to brief him coming across the river. And we were in this cabin cruiser, and I was going through the history of the land claim in Gunnesadage, the golf course expansion and, the Mohawk burial ground there and everything. But then as I was briefing him on this, I remembered he was Minister of Indian Affairs that rejected their specific claim back in the 70s. So he knew this probably better than I did. Anyways, we come across the river, a van picks us up, takes us to the meeting, and then he announces in the meeting, well, I'm going over there to meet with them, just spontaneously without saying anything. So I had to call up the warriors in the Gunnesadage Treatment Center, which was their base at the time, and say, would you be prepared to meet with Kretsch if he comes? And, they said yes. So then, everybody had to get into boats to go back to Lachine, and Ethel Blondin was with him, a Dene Liberal MP at the time. And of course, they didn't keep the cabin cruiser hanging around. It was going back and forth, so you had to take whatever boat you could get on. And they got into a boat, an open air boat, and went across, and it rained on them going across because, it was kind of cloudy that day. I got on a boat with Dave Nawagabo, the guy who talked me into getting into this liberal stuff, this Anishinaabe lawyer. And we didn't get rained on, but we got over there, and there they are wringing out their clothes, Ethel and Kretsch. And, of course, all kinds of people followed us from the meeting because they wanted to go into Oka, too. And we get there, and of course, there's thousands of Sûreté du Québec, the Quebec police there, and they had us sitting there for about 2 hours. We had to submit our names, and they were vetting us, I guess. And after about 2 hours, Kretsch said, tell them I'm leaving. And then that's when they said, oh, no, we approved these people to go in. So there was a list of us that were approved to go in with him. And we were walking up the hill. It was about 10 o'clock at night in the summertime there in July, and the sun's going down. And we get up to the top, and all these warriors with masks on and guns are coming up saying, hi, Russ, hi, Russ, hi, Russ. And Kretsch turns to look at me like, what did you get me into, kind of thing. But I remember him standing in the pines, in the glow of a 100-gallon drum that was a smudge to keep the mosquitoes off. And he's there saying, if I was prime minister, this wouldn't be happening, and, blah, blah, blah. And he said, I know John Chacha, who was the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs for Quebec, because Chacha used to work for him. He said, if you want, I can help get talks going again. So after that meeting, he did get the talks going again. But, of course, the standoff lasted for 78 days without any real resolution. But I bring that up to show you, I was on the inside of having to deal with the leader of the Liberal Party during a very tumultuous time. We were involved, during the Charlottetown Accord. We had to convince him to support the inherent right to self-government because that was part of the package Moroni was putting together. Of course, that was defeated in a national referendum. So in the 1993 federal election, we were involved in, we meaning the Aboriginal Commission, those of us, Dave Nawagabo and myself mainly, to convince the Liberal Party to include an Aboriginal platform in their election platform. And at first, Haviva Hosak, who was the research director for the Liberal Party of Canada at the time, says, oh, no, we can't have that in the platform because if you want that, the Italians are going to want in, and she started naming off all these other ethnic groups. And we said, hey, wait a minute. They don't have a section in the Constitution recognizing their rights like we do. So they conceded, okay, yes. And from then on, we had to fight the party establishment, to get an Aboriginal platform included in there, in what became the Red Book, Chapter 7 of the Red Book. But we went through a policy process where we involved a lot of people to have input into the draft policy. Not just Liberals, but we had it open to organizations and everybody. We held a number of events to make sure we were inclusive in developing that platform. And so we developed a longer platform, and we had to fight with Eddie Goldenberg and others within the party who were, trying to stop us on behalf of Kretsch. He never did it directly. He always had, intermediaries. But in the end, we got the short version, which became Chapter 7 in the Red Book, and the longer version that he announced during the campaign in October of 2017 in Waniesco, Saskatchewan, that cultural center. He announced it during the campaign. So once he formed the government, he named Ron Irwin, this former mayor of Sault Ste. Marie, as the Minister of Indian Affairs. And Dave and I were saying, well, who the heck is this guy? And so we looked into his background and found out he was the justice minister for Kretsch when he was, he was a justice critic for Kretsch when Kretsch was a justice minister negotiating the Constitution Act 1982. And obviously Kretsch had picked him, because that was one of his cronies, to keep the lid on Indian issues. And one of the first things they tried to do was amend the Indian Act, and that wasn't in the Red Book. That was clearly coming from Kretsch telling him what to do. Because Kretsch never got over the white paper. He still believes in it. He's still alive today. He still believes in it. And by that time, Dave and myself and Marilyn Buffalo were some of the founding executive members of the Aboriginal Peoples Commission, held a national press conference with Ovid McCready, denouncing Kretsch and saying he misled us and he broke the promises that were in the platform that we helped write, because he either broke or manipulated or ignored them. And one of them was we got them to agree that a Liberal government would act on the premise that the inherent right to self-government was an existing right in Section 35. Well, when he formed the government, he had people internally within the government develop a policy, which they unilaterally announced to the Alberta chiefs in 1995. They called it the inherent right policy. But it's the anything but inherent right policy, because it basically means you have to harmonize your laws as a First Nation with the federal and provincial laws. And that basically, because of what they say, what's on the table, what's not on the table, leaves basically municipal type powers, municipal type governments. So when you go into the self-government negotiations, you're converting from being an Indian Act band into becoming like a federal municipality. There's been a few bands that have done that. There are hundreds more that are negotiating under that policy. That was the main issue during the constitutional talks, whether self-government was an inherent right or contingent or delegated right. And of course, those talks ended in failure. And then the courts took over, starting with the Sparrow decision in 1990. The Supreme Court started to define Section 35. Right away, they said it is not absolute, it can be justifiably infringed. So any Aboriginal or treaty right argued in Section 35 can be justifiably infringed. And of course, if they argue extinguishment, there's a test for the Crown to say that it has to be clear and plain. Because according to Canadian law, prior to 1982, they could unilaterally extinguish rights. But after 1982, they need consent, as Janice pointed out. And so in 1995, when they introduced that so-called self-government policy, they also put money to it to entice people to start negotiating under it, and it worked. They got, like I say, hundreds of bands at the tables there. Not everybody is settled yet, but they've been negotiating since then for decades, basically. Having been involved in the Liberal platform process, I have a pretty good idea of how it works on the inside. They need the party wing of the party when they're, in an election mode. They need people to get out there, to volunteer, to work the doors, to raise money and all that. But once they form the government, the parliamentary wing takes over, the establishment. And they don't really need the party that much then. Resolutions can be passed at these Liberal conventions, but they're only recommendations. The government can decide if they're going to listen to them or not. And of course, on Aboriginal policy or Indigenous policy, Kretsch had his own mind made up of what he was prepared to accept. So, you know, these Indian Act amendments he proposed in 1996, I wound up working as the Indian Act Amendment coordinator for Ovid McCurdy when he was national chief. We analyzed it and told the chiefs it's worse than the status quo, so you should oppose it. And we were able to convince them that that was the case because we laid it all out in plain language, you know, what was being proposed. They agreed with us, and we defeated that bill. It became the Indian Act Optional Modification Act. They made it optional in the end when our campaign against it was successful. And it died on the order paper when they called the election in 1997. And so Kretsch was reelected with another majority. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples had come out in 1996 while I was still at AFN. We analyzed it in 1997. We held a special assembly on it, and we were looking at you know, what recommendations made sense and which ones didn't. So we had done some analysis of it. But with the 1997 election, he named Jane Stewart as the Minister of Indian Affairs to be kinder and gentler than Ron Irwin. Ron Irwin quit politics, and they gave him, I think he became ambassador to Ireland, some plum position like that. But Jane Stewart, what Kretsch told Phil Fontaine, who had just been elected national chief too, is go see Jane about the Royal Commission. But the Royal Commission said it had to be government-wide changes that took place for a new relationship. Of course, Kretsch and Irwin had, when they were still there, they said, oh, we're doing this already and it costs too much, so they put it on the shelf. But when Jane Stewart came in, and he came in with a new mandate in 97, they created a 5-year program called Gathering Strength where they gave some additional money. And they named George Erasmus the head of this Aboriginal Health Commission because he was one of the co-chairs of the Royal Commission. I think that was one way of stopping him from being critical about them not implementing the report or recommendations. But in any case, you know, in 1997, they tried to say we're going to implement some of the recommendations, the social and health recommendations of the Royal Commission. So by 2000, he named Robert Nold as his Minister of Indian Affairs because he was starting to look at, you know, moving towards retirement in his political career. And what they did was they repackaged that Indian Act Optional Modification Act into the First Nations Governance Act, where they wanted to impose national standards across all the bands because a lot of them weren't going into that self-government policy. So they were taking some of the principles of self-government policy and wanting to impose it through legislation. We were able to fight that too and get the NDP and the Bloc Québécois to help us slow it down. And then at one point, Paul Martin, who was you know, looking to take over from Kretsch, publicly said he didn't think it should go ahead. And when he made that public comment, that helped kill it. And it died, you know, when the government changed as well. And when Paul Martin came in, you know, he just did these roundtables on Aboriginal policy. He didn't really do much concrete. He signed some political accords with the national Aboriginal organizations. And this whole thing about the Kelowna Accord, you know, that's a myth that was created. It was the media that called it the Kelowna Accord. I was there for the Eastern Door, the Ganawagi newspaper. I got in as in media credentials. And the only thing that happened in Kelowna was a First Ministers meeting. But that's where Paul Martin offered, I think, about $10 billion over 5 years in different areas. The provinces didn't come up with any money because they didn't want to take on Canada's constitutional responsibilities, you know, of offloading. And it basically was a press release, you know, detailing amounts of money going into what sectors. And of course, there was an election after that. Paul Martin was gone, and 10 years of Harper. But Harper was implementing liberal policies. The self-government policy he implemented, and he was implementing the land claims policies, which really go back to Pierre Trudeau. The comprehensive claims policy and specific claims policies were announced in 1973 after the Nisga'a won a court case against Canada. And that's the policies that Justin is implementing today. the policies of Trudeau and Kretsch, Trudeau's lieutenant there, who was as Minister of Indian Affairs. That's the legacy that we're dealing with in all this. And that's why the white paper tenets are still alive and well, because that's the ideas that this government has carried forward with for the past number of decades. When Indians opposed the white paper with the red paper and other papers in 1970, 71, I've got letters from internal to the department saying, well, the idea was still good. We're just going to extend the time frame, and we're going to talk about it in components rather than as a whole package. And that's what they've been doing. If you look at the past number of decades, including under Mulroney, they had a document leak out called the Buffalo Jump of the 1980s. It basically was taking the tenets of the white paper and proposing to use programs and services to achieve their objectives of assimilating Indians and terminating their rights. That's why they used the metaphor Buffalo Jump. It was to herd buffaloes over Indians over a metaphorical cliff. And so springing forward to 2015, you have Justin Trudeau announcing his platform about promising a nation-to-nation relationship, a reconciliation process, a review of law and policy to decolonize Canada's laws and policies. This all sounded good. The problem is, when the government says something in a platform, they have their interpretation and meaning of it, and we have ours. In this case, the Trudeau Liberals co-opted our terminology, like they did with the inherent right. They emptied it out of any meaning and gave it a policy definition, which is not what we meant when we used the term inherent right. So, you have to decode their language because Ottawa speaks in code. The SWAT strategy really was a public relations firm telling, the federal government, you have to control the dialogue. In order to do that, you have to have special words and tactics, have a team around the minister to be able to instantaneously respond to the media and that. In that case, they were fighting with the Crees, and the court case the Grand Council of the Crees of Quebec had for the federal government not implementing the James Bay Agreement. But basically, the idea is the same thing. You do a public relations communication strategy to convince the public that you're helping these Indians. One of the things they came up with at the time when my wife and I were part of the protest on them cutting the post-secondary education program when Mulroney was still in power, and Willie Littlechild was a Conservative MP trying to shut us down too at the time. They came up with the term free education, that SWAT strategy. And of course the public latched onto that saying, oh, they're getting free education. Well, that's not true. Our post-secondary education we paid for dearly, but the government considers it a social policy, not a right. These are some of the issues we still have problems with in terms of public policy versus rights. Anyway, so Trudeau makes these promises about nation to nation, reconciliation, a review of law and policy. But what's he been doing since he came to power? He's been operating in secret, in a top-down, non-transparent way. First thing he did was he entered into memorandums of agreement with the national Indigenous organizations, including the Assembly of First Nations. July 27, he did one in 2016 on fiscal relations. And then in 2017, he did one on shared priorities. And part of the shared priorities, if you look at the AFN Canada MOU that the Prime Minister and Perry Bellegarde signed, talks about implementing the TRC recommendations and the UN Declaration and being part of this law and policy review. So a month after signing that, Jody Wilson-Raybould, the Justice Minister, issues these 10 federal principles on Indigenous relationships. And she never consulted any. I saw a press conference where the 3 national Indigenous leaders said they weren't consulted about that. It was a press conference they were having about why they were boycotting the Premier's meeting. And it was only Nathan Obed who was honest and said, no, they never told us. And Perry Bellegarde said, oh, I'm going to be meeting her this afternoon. He didn't say that he was consulted, though, and later on he did publicly admit he wasn't consulted. So you look at those principles, you unpack them. One of the first principle is recognizing the Indigenous right of self-determination, including the inherent right. Well, when you look at their inherent right policy, that's what they're talking about. That's what they're still implementing today, is that 1995 policy. They say they aim to get free prior informed consent. They don't say they're going to accept it. So they're watering down FPIC. They're rewriting and gutting basically the UN Declaration articles through those 10 principles. And those 10 principles amount to being preconditions to everything that they're doing, including the changes to education funding agreements, all the legislation that they're looking at. The 10 principles are guiding what the Trudeau government's prepared to do. And it's based on, the British North America Act 1867, so it's based on the continued domination of the federal and provincial governments over us. It's based on the doctrine of discovery, which is what Canada bases its assertion of sovereignty and territorial integrity on. So, you really have to unpack those 10 principles to see where they're going. And then in August of last year, they announced that they were dissolving the Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development and creating 2 new departments. And they didn't talk to the national organizations, their partners, about that, let alone community people. And so they're proceeding with that, and that has, a lot of implications for the machinery of government. How is the government going to recognize our rights? So then, we get to Valentine's Day of this year. The Prime Minister announces he's going to introduce legislation to recognize and implement our rights, a rights recognition framework. And, once he announced that, there's a lot of details he hasn't given, but we know a lot already from what he said. One of the things we know is that his framework comes from Jody Wilson-Raybould. She did a governance toolkit when she was AFN BC Regional Chief back in 2013. And if you go through that governance toolkit, you'll see she was promoting recognition legislation federally and provincially then. And she had worked with Senator Jerry St. Germain, a conservative senator, on Bill S-212, which died in 2013, but that was recognition self-government legislation. And, the high idea of having recognition legislation goes back actually to the Penner Report in 1983. They had a government called Bill C-52. I remember we called it B-52. But it died on the order paper because an election was called, and that's when Mulroney got in. There was a BC Recognition and Reconciliation Act in 2009. Art Magno and grassroots peoples killed that because, it was going to recognize BC title. It had bypassed the grassroots. So a lot of that legislation kind of frames the ideas that were behind Jody Wilson's toolkit. And now they issued Budget 2018, which makes it clear how they're going to spend their money for the next 5 years, and it also clarifies where they're going, to me anyway. Also, there was a March 2nd article in Maclean's you should read about Jody Wilson-Raybould's vision to save Canada, because that connected a lot of dots for me about her rise in the Liberal Party and how her toolkit became accepted by the Liberal government. That's the basis of Trudeau's framework that's coming. He said he's going to introduce it later this year, and he wants it passed by next year. And given that they have a majority, they can ram it through, no problem. But getting back to Budget 2018, he's pointing out that the Department of Indigenous Services and the Department of Crown Indigenous Relations, the legislation, the framework that's coming, will be creating those 2 new departments. Because right now, I keep wanting to call her Jade Stewart, but Carolyn Bennett doesn't have a statutory mandate. She's operating by cabinet mandates. So they want to pass a law to give her a mandate to negotiate these modern treaties and self-government agreements. And basically, what I see is Trudeau's framework now is based on their fiscal policy, our fiscal relations processes. And there's two tracks. There's a draft self-government fiscal policy that they've been negotiating with those who've signed self-government or modern treaties already. About 22 of them, a little bit more, I think. I think about 18 of them, the modern treaties have self-government components. But in there, they're saying if you want to be a federally recognized Indigenous government, you have to sign a self-government agreement or a comprehensive claim settlement or some kind of self-government arrangement. Otherwise, you're an Indian Act band, which is a non-governing body governed under the Indian Act with the discretion of the minister and the department. Because under the Indian Act, the government controls the reserves, the social development through programs, pretty much everything. And that's most of the bands in the country. So the fiscal relations process that those Indian Act bands are under is to improve the contribution agreements and also improve their capacity in order for them to be able to sign self-government agreements. For those who've signed already, they're going to have transfer agreements, not contribution agreements. They're going to have transfer payments, and they're working on the formula of those. And part of the formula includes own source revenue. So they're only going to transfer so much money for governance and programs, and you have to make up the difference through taxation and other economic development or revenue sharing if you can get a province to agree. So it's like an assembly line. If you're an Indian Act band, they're going to use the money to process you to sign either a self-government agreement or a comprehensive claims agreement, depending on where you are. And then once you do that, you're going to wind up with the ones that are negotiating now to get transfer payments as Indigenous governments. And even in their legislation, if you look at Bill C-69, this impact assessment, National Energy Board legislation, Indian Act bands don't have any recognition in there. You're only an Indigenous governing council if you're negotiating or implementing a self-government agreement or a modern treaty. And so that's throughout their legislation. There's also that access to information bill. The same thing, they don't recognize band councils as governments. So they don't recognize any inherent rights, basically, unless it's federally recognized. So when the Prime Minister says that this framework is going to recognize and implement rights, he means rights is defined by the federal policies of self-government and comprehensive claims, not what we think. So when we think about nation to nation, he meant federal cabinet to AFN. And because he's using the Assembly of First Nations, whose budget has increased from 10 million to 35 million for this year, 2018, 2019. And they have over 126 employees because they're being employed to help implement this framework that's coming. And there's still more details to see, like we'll have to see what the legislation says. But it's pretty clear to me that they want to take the 1995 self-government policy and a version of the comprehensive claims policies and elevate them into legislation to be the framework for negotiations. And given that 2/3 of, like over 400 of the 600 bands in the country are already at what I call a termination table, it's not too hard to get them to complete into final agreements. Budget 2016, 17, and 18 have added $16.55 billion in new dollars on top of the 10 billion or so each year that the government was already spending. So that's why you're not hearing anything from AFN or the chiefs about any critical analysis of the 10 principles, this unilateral splitting of the department, any of this, because they're too busy going to conferences to figure out how they're going to spend this new money. Which is being spread out over a number of years. A lot of it's being put back until after the next federal election. Like that 2016 budget, I think $2 billion is after the next federal election. So it's basically, if you want to see the rest of the money, you got to re-elect us. So that's the Liberal strategy for all this. And in my view, they've just rebranded termination as reconciliation because they haven't really changed anything. I do sit, again, full disclosure, I do sit as the Quebec technical rep on AFN's Chiefs Committee on Lands, Territories and Resources. They haven't said that they're going to review that comprehensive claims policy. And they haven't said they're going to review the inherent right policy, at least not publicly. And the other thing they've done is they've set up this new category of tables called recognition and self-determination tables, which include Métis and other groups. And they're saying the outputs of those discussions are going to feed into the framework. But basically, the framework's going to say what's on the table and what's not on the table for negotiation, what's negotiable and not negotiable, just like that 1995 inherent right policy does. No matters of national interest dealing with trade and commerce are on the table. Basically, just local matters, small businesses, that kind of thing. So they're doing a really good communications job because they're going to say they're going to help us with self-government, and they're calling it self-determination. So again, they're trying to define what self-determination is. They've completely bypassed the communities who are the actual rights holders. Now they're doing a national engagement process, which is really a public relations exercise, because I believe they already have a draft ready that I've heard they've already shown some provinces a draft. And they're just going through the exercise of convincing us now that we're being consulted or engaged. But they're already to go with their plan. They've been working on it for 2 years in secret. So that's pretty much my take on it.
That's it.
That's it.
I also speak better when standing. I like to fidget a lot. You probably noticed me. I wasn't sitting still. Anyways, my name is Mr. Piers Kreps. I put Mr. there because I think that only lasts for so long before I get a PhD and I become Dr. Kreps. Anyways, I want to thank our panelists for sharing their thoughts. I really don't know what to believe anymore with SWAT teams and liberal insiders and all that. So this is a presentation about my beliefs before this panel. All right, I'll get started, I guess, with a bit more about me. As Shiri has mentioned, I'm an Inuk student. I was born up in Inuvik, where the hospital is. My family's from Tuktoyaktuk, which is exactly right there. I've actually been an urban, or rather a southern Inuk for about 2 decades, and I think it's important to mention that because, I've been disconnected from my culture for quite some time now. That has helped shape my beliefs, as I've kind of alluded to already, and of course the Inuit experience is much different than the First Nations or the Métis experience, and that's something I might touch upon a bit later. I'm a 5th-year political science student seeking master's offers, if you guys know anyone. Currently, I'm one of the co-presidents of the Cooperative of Indigenous Studies Students and Alumni. This is one of our many Indigenous student societies on campus. And this has also helped shape my experiences and just guided me here today. And I also work as an RA in the department on a fun water project. Well, I'll be talking a bit about some final thoughts and, again, some of the initiatives that we're working here as students on campus, as Indigenous students on campus. And as Shiri has mentioned, we did recently collaborate with the McMaster Model UN team to deliver the first known model permanent form on Indigenous issues in the Canadian University Model UN network. And that's really exciting, of course, to see this happen, for our students to get an opportunity to discuss Indigenous issues in this sort of manner. So we partnered, of course, with Indigenous Student Services, really helpful department. That's one thing that has really allowed our students to get the best experience here at McMaster, and we partnered, of course, with CISA and with the Model UN team. And that fit in with the Model UN's theme of reconciliation and culture. Of course, we're seeing reconciliation pop up a lot in the past few years, but the culture component was really nice because it wasn't just Indigenous culture. We got to see a Bhangra dance performance they opened off the Model UN conference, and that was great. So there were 10 committees that varied, of course, across the Model UN network, and we did deliver the Model Permanent Form. So this is the team that participated in the Model Permanent Form. They discussed kind of 3 pressing issues, of course, the water crisis, the systemic inequalities, which we've been chatting about all morning, that has reshaped my perceptions, and also climate change and its impacts on Indigenous communities. So we did see delegates that were representing a number of nation states and broader international coalitions such as the Arctic Council, International Labour Organization, and of course settler states like Canada, New Zealand. We actually had Myanmar in the presentation, or sorry, in the permanent forum, which was really interesting, seeing their experiences with climate change and water quality. And the goal of this, I think, is to establish this more permanently within the McMaster Model UN conference, so Indigenous students have an opportunity to further engage in these conversations, of course, and potentially bridge this with attending the real permanent forum in New York City. So I'm currently working that out and hoping to attend next month, which is very exciting. So please let your students know, let your family know, your cousins. Please send them here next year for the Model Permanent Forum, because the president of the university has committed to making this happen for future Model UN conferences here at McMaster. Now I'll move on to a few closing thoughts of my own upon Truth and Reconciliation and UNDRIP. This is a headline from the Toronto Saturday Star 8 years ago now, almost 8 years ago now. And I think Janice has really hit this point really well. And of course, we all talk about this. There can be no reconciliation without truth, of course. The story here, there were some participants in the Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, that had actually passed away during the focus groups and discussions. And I think what the Star was getting at with this is that there would be no truth or reconciliation for them because they passed away. But what I take from this headline here is that we can't reconcile if we don't know what we're reconciling with. And within these 10 principles that our Justice Minister has, worked with the SWAT team to deliver to us, there's no mention of truth on that poster. There's mention of self-determination, of self-government, of reconciliation, of course, Section 35, but nowhere on that poster, if I was looking at the right one, did I see the word truth. So that kind of speaks to the priorities that our Department of Justice and our government have. This image here is kind of funny, but I think what I was talking about, there being different truths and different experiences, there might be some experiences in Alberta that I don't know anything about, but of course, she might not know about my experiences up in the north. But the one overarching truth here, the cylinder that you might see, is that the Canadian government just continues to exploit Indigenous peoples, and they're kind of skirting the issue. They're not exposing, of course, the real truth here. If I were to touch upon important articles of the TRC, Peter Russell, one of the directors and real facilitators of the RCAP, a great ally from my perspective, has stated that Call to Action 53 is incredibly important for us to capitalize upon in a way. What it allows us to do is establish a national council for reconciliation. Now, what I see this as is an opportunity to, it says here, monitor and evaluate. There are 2 stages within this call to action. It allows us to monitor and evaluate and report upon the reconciliation process. Of course, this is in collaboration with the federal government, as we've talked about today, but it provides us with a real opportunity to report upon the monitoring and evaluation we're already doing and put that in some sort of formalized council. So those are the 2 themes: monitor and evaluation, and then development and implementation. This is sort of the cycle that we need to work within, as reconciliation is the ongoing process. Of course, the formulation of these documents takes a very long time, and the implementation takes even longer, as we can see. So having this council in place is incredibly important so we can ensure that our voices are being communicated and heard when it comes to reconciliation. And an interesting point that I've heard recently is that we have this opportunity, maybe until the next federal election, to use the money that Russ has talked about, to implement some of these calls to action. Who knows what's going to happen next? So I want to see Reconciliation Council happen. Moving on to UNDRIP. Unfortunately, again, we don't have Sharon here to provide us with some of her legal perspectives on UNDRIP, but it does focus, of course, on the individual rights and collective rights, how that works in conjunction with the Charter and with other Canadian frameworks, Section 35. You know, it remains to be seen. But one of the points that I think is very important to stress, again, I'm an undergraduate student, so I'd like to borrow ideas from other scholars. But Canada is really obsessed with FPIC, and that's really great because, of course, it is the foundation for our relationship with the Canadian nation. And this is really seen, I think, in resource development. We're not seeing it expanded upon in the other aspects of our relationship with the Canadian state. The bigger picture is UNDRIP, and we're not seeing some of the social policies being addressed. We're not seeing the truths. We're not really seeing reconciliation in that sense. I like this diagram. It's pretty cool. Anyways, those are just some of my closing thoughts on the matter. Koinani, thank you. I'll let Shiri take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very impressive undergraduate work. Excited to see what you do in the future and to hear about your work. Is this on? Yeah. And thank you to all of you for your really incredible overviews and deep dives into the implications and meanings of these so-called new frameworks. But I think, as Pete DeGangi says, INEC hasn't had a new idea in 150 years. So you can see the repetition, but also the assembly line of these policies as they roll out now. There's a microphone at the back if people have questions. We do have about 10 minutes. Maybe as people approach the mic, I'll turn the conversation towards the future in thinking about as these policies, as these new frameworks roll out at this kind of bewildering pace, the fiscal policy changes, the rights and recognition tables, the MOUs, the new Indigenous rights frameworks, and so on. What points are there for intervention, particularly focusing on the points that Russ and Janice, you made about whether the rights holders are actually being consulted? Is that a point of pressure, or is this are things getting to a point where only mass movement and mobilization can really penetrate the kind of coding, the deep coding that the Liberal government is doing of genocide?
Well, I think there needs to be mass mobilization, but in order for that to happen, people have to understand the truth and not what they're being told. You know, the fact that the Liberal government has co-opted our terminology, I think we have to get an analysis out there to really show what's going on and get community people motivated and mobilized to take this on. But honestly, they have a majority government. They have the chiefs of the country, most of them. I wouldn't say all of them, but most of them. They have the Assembly First Nations, the national chief, the executive, all the way down, basically going along because they have shared priorities. They're not controlling the pen or the process, but they're definitely going along with it. The budget 2018 says they're going to spend $15 million a year on what they call the permanent bilateral mechanisms, which is Ottawa talk for saying AFN Cabinet Committee, where they meet with the Prime Minister once every year and with ministers more regularly with AFN delegations on implementing, you know, what's going out. If this legislation passes, this framework legislation passes, like the Prime Minister says he wants to do by next year before the next federal election, it's going to impact for generations because, and they know that. Jody Wilson-Raybould told the Quebec chiefs, we want to see it passed, so no matter what happens in the next federal election, it'll be hard for the next government to undo anything. I personally think that the government got tired of waiting for everybody to come up to get to a table, so they're going to use the money as a carrot or stick to induce people if Indian Act bands will say, oh, well, there's more money if we go into a self-government agreement. And of course, they have to convince their people of this. And the people might say, oh, we'll get more programs and services. So it's actually a pretty good strategy because they're going to use the money to herd the buffaloes to that cliff. It seems like they've decided, under the Trudeau government with their majority to use it.
I just want to add on to some of what Russ is talking about. So when we saw what was happening with the 10 principles being released in July, Idle No More and Defenders put together a critical analysis of those principles. And it's on the Idle No More website, and we were the only group to do that. And what we're dealing with here is what Arthur Manuel would call coming up against establishment organizations such as the AFN and other political lobby groups that are really co-opted and are pursuing and pushing the government agenda instead of doing critical analysis, which they would have done maybe 10, 15 years ago. And so that's where we're at with that. In the region that I come from, I've been doing this presentation for over a month now, and we're trying to inform the communities in the treaty territories so that they're aware of what's happening. And when they see what is coming down, they're scared because they see, a lot of the elders see it as like a rebranding of what happened with the white paper, and it was our region who led the development of the red paper. So they can see that. And so when they see that, it's like they want to do something to mobilize against what's coming down here. And I think that's a really key part of developing that energy and synergy to push back on what's happening. And for those, I try to put updates on Facebook. And yesterday, you kind of reach a point where you just have to be bluntly honest and truthful of what we're seeing through these documents. And I just said, we're in the fight for our lives, because we are. If we don't do anything to stop this, like Russ said, we are generations from now going to be impacted. And the livelihood and relationship that we have to the land and those responsibilities that come with taking care of the land through our own laws and legal orders will be very difficult if we have to be in a position where we are taxing our own people, and because our people are unable or incapable of paying property taxes, because what happens in self-government is you give up title to your lands for fee simple, and then you end up being in the position of the Niska right now, where they've had to sell off their homes and territory just to meet paying taxes on their lands. So that is where we are heading. And I just briefly wanted to mention a couple things that I think people need to be aware of. In 2012, one of the chiefs in the areas that I come from went to the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination at the UN and posed the question to the committee members there, what documents is Canada relying on to say that it has title to our lands? And in those spaces, the governments who are responding to the committee are supposed to answer questions within a short time period. They still haven't answered the question of that as evidence of proof. The other part, which Russ, I was supposed to go to Geneva with him this past summer, but I didn't. He and other delegation of people trying to put forward very strong positions of sovereignty and title to lands, made submissions to the CERD body, and what came of that in August was a letter coming from CERD to Canada, a report coming from CERD to Canada saying you have to recognize that Indigenous peoples have the right to FPIC. And everything else that you're doing in terms of creating processes, doing the window dressing that is outside getting consent is a violation of the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And that's international law. So I want to put that out there for people to know that these are things that the lobby groups are supposed to be doing, but they're not doing. They're actually working against our people, and that's why it's so important to gather like this to share information so that we can mobilize and develop strategies and campaigns to oppose what's coming down, because like I said, we're in the fight for our lives. And if we don't do something, our children and grandchildren and children's children will be impacted forever. So I don't know if people have any questions based on some of the information.
I just want to make a couple of last points too, quickly. All of this billions and billions of dollars is being spent on what Art Manuel would call the 0.2% land base. Because as he points out, you know, if you add up all the reserves in Canada, it's only 0.2% of Canada's land mass. 99.8 is controlled by the provinces and the feds. Trudeau never mentions lands, territories, and resources. It's all programs, and it's all dependency Indian Act programs on reserve. And the final thing I would say is we have a website called unsettling150.ca. That's where our we also have the analysis of the 10 principles there, as well as a lot of other information on what we've been doing. And that comes from Art Manuel's book, Unsettling Canada, that we created that website and campaign to try and disrupt Canada's 150 celebrations there. So if you want information, that's a good site to go to. Thank you.
The presentations were all about how the government is unable, unwilling to do, if I can put it in broad terms, the right thing. And so my question is, do you think it's primarily economic, political, in the sense that the voters in Canada would punish or resist government from doing the right thing, or theoretical in the sense that somehow the government just doesn't want to accept the nation-to-nation concept, economic, political, or theoretical?
For sure, it's economic. It's about helping the provinces keep stolen lands, territories, and resources. That's why he's focusing on the on-reserve programs. You know, the 10 principles reinforces the Constitution Act 1867. You know, we have unfinished business. Canada's Constitution, there was a Section 37 process which ended in 1987. But my view has always been that Section 35, it was supposed to identify Aboriginal treaty rights. We never did finish that talk. You know, if this was South Africa, and Canada's pretty parallel to it, if we had millions of people of color, we'd be rewriting that Constitution to accommodate us. But we don't have the numbers, so we have to convince Canadians to work with us on doing that. And that's what the networks of defenders of the land and I Don't Know More do, is work with allies to help us get fundamental change. And, you know, the thing I would say about the slogan, real change can be good or bad. You know, and an opportunity or a threat. And my view is the change that Trudeau represents it's a threat to our rights. But he always did tell us openly he's for the middle class. And the middle class is subsidized, the economy of Canada is subsidized by our stolen lands, territories, and resources. And so that's who he's going to pander to, because he wants to get reelected. So it is economic in my view, because if they were going to have fundamental change and expand our land bases so that we're economically viable and have an Indigenous jurisdiction that displaces the federal and provincial jurisdictions instead of municipal governments, Canada would be a different place. That's the kind of future I think you were talking about. That's the one I believe in. But we have a lot of forces working against us. And I'm at the age now where I don't know if I'll see it.
Well, we have 2 days together, so if you have a question that you didn't get to ask, hopefully you can approach the panelists. Hopefully hopefully you can approach the panelists over the next couple days, or there'll be more opportunity for discussion. The next panel will be starting at 11 o'clock. It's on conceptualizing self-government in a post-Indian Act and Daniel's decision world. We hope you'll join us. Please join me now in thanking our panelists for an incredible start to this day. Now there'll be a 15-minute break.